I'm Heather Hotchkiss, and I'm the Principal Brain Injury Specialist at the Colorado Department of Education. And I have been in the field of special ed for many years in various capacities. This is just a synopsis of my experience, and came to the department in this position in 2012. So have been in this position since then. I have the pleasure of co-presenting today with my colleague, Donna, and I will let her introduce herself.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you so much for presenting to us this evening. It's very important and very important information. I'm Donna, and I lead our brain injury resource team for Poudre School District, and I also am an occupational therapist in the school district, and I've been in the field of brain injury for about 20 years, and happy to be here and present with Heather. So thank you for joining us.
So here's what we're going to cover this evening. What are fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and the types of brain injury or impact we might be talking about when we talk about FASD. What some of those characteristics and similarities across other health conditions might look like or be, because that really lends itself to that hidden disability piece, because we're not always understanding FASD when we look at some of those characteristics. And then what school teams can do and the approach that we can take as educators and parents to help understand where kids are functioning, and also understand the special education or 504, but special ed for sure, considerations when we talk about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. So let's just talk about terminology a little bit in the beginning so that we can have a clear understanding of really what we're talking about here. So if we've got this big umbrella of brain injury or brain impact, if you will, there's a couple of different categories that we want to identify. Acquired brain injury, that blue box, is after birth. And those subtypes of that are traumatic and non-traumatic. And so when we talk about, acquired brain injury, that's an after birth injury that happens that we put into those categories. The green represents congenital or prenatal, or you might hear organic descriptors for those before birth or prenatal kinds of conditions. Exposure to substances such as alcohol is an example of a congenital brain impact. So while the mechanisms of brain impact can be very different, either prenatal or acquired, we have some similar areas, and there are definitely unique needs and areas that we think about within each one of these categories, but there are some similar interventions to address some of those impacts. And so my job at the Department of Education covers both of these areas, the congenital or that kind of prenatal brain impact and how we understand that from the get-go, and acquired, so some level of typical development up until an injury happens, and then we have change or differences in that brain function. So let's jump into this green side, the congenital side, and truly understand fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. So the cause of FASD is exposure to alcohol while in utero. So during pregnancy, exposure to alcohol happens. Alcohol is a teratogen, as we know, which is a chemical capable of interfering with that typical development. So it can cause lots of different types of, or a range of effects, neurological and physical being a couple of those. We also know that of all the substances with the most research behind it is alcohol, and that alcohol produces the most serious neurobehavioral effects in the fetus. So when we talk about and we take in the Surgeon General's recommendation that there is no safe amount of alcohol at any time during pregnancy, this is the reason, because alcohol can be very, very damaging, as well as there's no kind of path that alcohol is guaranteed not to damage, right? Or not to make some type of impact, negative impact across the gestation chart or developing embryo. So when we look at this chart, the way to kind of understand this is the dark purple areas and those areas that are in development in that dark during those dark purple time frames, it can lead to alcohol exposure can lead to structural changes. So differences in the actual way that not only our brain develops, but our whole body. So it can be physical, it can be other health conditions associated with that. When those bars turned from that dark purple to pink, structural damage can still happen, but then we're talking a lot of functional differences that can happen. So when we think about the full developmental time frame for this, alcohol at any time along here can be very, very harmful. So, and we many times have many weeks before a young woman is even known to be pregnant, and so there can be damage being done even before a known pregnancy is at hand. Um, and then the typical time for the first prenatal visit might be a matter of weeks after that. So there's lots and lots of development before that time frame. So that's why we call it a spectrum disorder, because any time during that developmental time frame, damage can happen, and it can look very different depending on when that is, how much it is, all of those things. So it really is referred to kind of as the spectrum as that full range. Fetal alcohol syndrome, which you might be familiar with that terminology, is represents only the tip of the iceberg. Only a small percentage of kids across that full spectrum will meet the clinical criteria of fetal alcohol syndrome. And that requires that diagnosis, it requires specific physical and cognitive and behavioral implications within that. So there is clinical criteria for that, but it really does represent only a small amount of kids that would be considered on that spectrum. So we're talking a lot more kids than what fetal alcohol syndrome might represent. So let's look at some additional facts about this. We do know that no amount of alcohol is safe, is proven to be safe across that time frame. We know that 40 to 50% of pregnancies are unplanned. So you're not expecting, so you're not cued into perhaps that time frame and when you might be pregnant. So, and we also know that our healthcare providers may not be providing great information by way of alcohol effects, or they're not even addressing it at all. So there's not even an educational component to a healthcare visit early on about alcohol intake and the effects that that can have. People with FASD can grow, can improve, and function well in life with the proper support. And there's some protective factors that we will address in a little bit. So we also know that there's a ton of stigma, right, associated with this. Our families need support. And there is not one mother on the face of the earth that would say that would do something like this intentionally of, yep, I know 100% that I'm going to negatively affect my unborn child for their lifetime, and I'm still choosing to ingest alcohol willy-nilly along that timeline. It doesn't happen. It is not as an it is not an intentional act. So please, please, please do everything that we can in breaking down that stigma and judgment in this world. It's around supports and services at this point in time. So please know that that is not an intentional act by all means. The diagnostic terminology, this can get confusing because fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is not a diagnostic term. Like I said, fetal alcohol syndrome is. It has international classification in the ICD-10 diseases list of diseases. It is it was first identified in or labeled as far as a clinical diagnosis in 1973 and built then over time. But it also, the clinical criteria requires cognitive and behavioral and physical characteristics. So for all three of those, at the extent of that clinical criteria to be present, may or may not happen. What we know about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is it is truly a spectrum. It's an umbrella term describing that range, that full range. Some could be very physical, some could be very developmental or cognitive, some could be um, neurological or behavioral. So it really does represent uh, a range of areas that can be affected by alcohol exposure. So it's not a diagnosis. Now, I will say that many of our diagnosticians in Colorado are adding fetal alcohol spectrum disorder to the diagnoses if they are once if they are trained in this area. And we do have a building list of trained professionals in our state. And in the resources is a link to that. So if there has been prenatal alcohol exposure, you know where to go to get a diagnosis. So this is the umbrella of FASD. So it does include, obviously, that fetal alcohol syndrome, that clinical criteria that is very restrictive, or does represent a few kids. Partial fetal alcohol syndrome, or PFAS, you may or may not see some of it. Some refer to that as a kind of an outdated term, um, you could see that. Alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, you may see ARND, you may see static encephalopathy as by way of a diagnosis. You may see or a diagnosis, and you may see neurobehavioral disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure, or NDPAE, which is currently in our DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of diseases. So, and mental health disorders. Alcohol-related birth defects, ARBD, might be another one that you might see. So that umbrella really captures many different diagnoses or disorders. So that's why we call it a spectrum, or fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, because it really does represent all of those, or what could be all of those. So the fact is that the majority of persons with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders don't have any physical features. So it's not like you would get the facial features that are required in FAS. They may have very typical range of skills, IQ being one of those. They could have great language skills or memory skills, but then show some differences by way of overwhelmedness or executive function kinds of abilities, there may not be a great connect for consequences to actions. So cause and effect might be an impact. But that benefit from early diagnosis and early intervention is definitely the case. And this is kind of the reason why is at a young age, we may not see a lot of differences, right? We're talking infancy, we're talking infants don't have a lot of skills. And so we provide those supports. We don't expect them to have language. We don't expect them to not tantrum when their needs aren't met, all of those kinds of things. So it may not look very different between typical and FASD type of developmental kind of structures, um, or what we're seeing on the outside. But over time, as they age, this gap gets bigger, and it takes longer. You might have a more kind of immature child, or immature set of skills, and just as that developmental kind of trajectory happens over time, typical developing kids look very different, and that gap just gets wider and wider. So it might look way different at the age of 16 versus the age of 2. Um, so so prevalence rates. We know that FASD is more common than autism, spina bifida, and Down syndrome combined. So when we look at alcohol use during pregnancy and or exposure, alcohol exposure, and 1 in 20 kids may have fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. That's 1 in every classroom minimally, may have an FASD, and their brain may function differently because of that alcohol exposure. So again, it can manifest in physical issues, behavioral or intellectual issues. It is a lifelong or chronic issue or health condition. Needs just change over time. And so for us to, if we know this, or if a student is diagnosed at an early age with regard to fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and we have this knowledge and we have this information, we don't expect kids to grow out of it. We don't expect kids to get a certain amount of service and then be done, so to speak. It is a lifelong condition. Um, yes, many characteristics might look like other health conditions. We see word and or letter reversal here. This list on the left was given to a young woman who has fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and was asked just to copy it. Simply copy the bulleted list. And this is the result of that. So we're talking about, you know, literacy types of manifestations for sure with regards to this. And if we talk about 1 in 20, it may or may not show up in writing, just like this, but we're talking about a lot of kids, perhaps. And so it's difficult, right? Because of these overlapping characteristics, it's difficult to put your finger on it. And so how do we understand differences between FASDs and ADHD, or FASDs and autism, or FASDs and other types of mental health kinds of concerns, or even trauma and poverty? I mean, we see some of these overlapping characteristics across all of these different conditions. So when we talk about treatment over that lifetime, it really does change, has to change over time when we talk about supports and services. So in really understanding what the needs are, for that support and service plan to be effective. Protective factors, yes, we definitely have protective factors that help reduce the effects over that lifetime. And diagnosis before age 6 is one of those protective factors. Also, that stability, nurturing, consistent home environment, as well as professionals being involved as needed and as appropriate with regards to special education or social services or psychological services and supports, et cetera. So lots of ways that we can put structures in place that help with those outcomes, and for kids to become, great functioning adults. Um, so this is that uh, website that can get you to professionals trained in this area to help with early diagnosis or late diagnosis. It doesn't matter. Diagnosis is good at any time. Earlier the better, because then you can talk about earlier supports and services or interventions being applied, and the lens that is really does help us understand learning issues or behavioral issues. So there's some national and state resources on the NoFast website, which is this first one, or Colorado Illuminate, or Illuminate Colorado's website. Um, so considerations. If we don't know about prenatal health, if we've got a lack of information, or a student has come through the foster or adopt kind of process and we don't even have access to it, um, we still may have reason to look at this student with a brain-based approach or understanding the brain and development. We may never get that information, and that's okay. But we've got a kid in front of us who needs support, right? So, what are some of the things that we might think about when we want to apply that brain-based approach? Multiple diagnoses is one of those. I know many, many students who have fetal alcohol spectrum disorders not only meet the criteria of many other conditions, health conditions, but also have several diagnoses. So going on at once. I know of a young man who had 13 different diagnoses. Um, all 13 is, it's okay, but it's we've still got a kid with needs that we have to do our digging and our detective work as educators to understand really what services and supports are appropriate, regardless of what diagnosis or labels kind of come with that file, so to speak, but how that student's really functioning. If a student's a puzzle, not responding well to interventions in a typical manner, that could be learning, that could be behavior, not responding to medicine. Maybe they are on medicines for one of these, various diagnoses, um, and not responding in a typical way. The brain could be working very differently, and not, and that's why that different response is warranted, or being exhibited. A lack of understanding of cause and effect, and that uneven profile. Um, so whether we do or don't know about prenatal substance exposure, we do need to apply the building blocks of brain development. And that framework is a framework that was created for educators and parents, to, in a very simplistic a way, to understand how that brain is functioning. There's three components to this uh, building blocks of brain development framework: cognitive processes, the building blocks themselves, um, which are those cognitive processes, the assessment strategies to get to those. This are done in school settings by school personnel, and interventions that are linked with each one of those. Um, So this is the building blocks of brain development graphic, so to speak, and framework. It is hierarchical for a reason, because our brains do develop kind of in a hierarchical manner. It's not a one-to-one relationship, though. So when we look at this foundational or fundamental level, the orange level, memory, and 100% of our memory is not fully developed until processing speed comes into play. That doesn't happen. It's all, we were born with capacities to develop all of these, and they all develop um, in uh, in in concert, but also If we don't look at our fundamental processes and don't understand where a kid's functioning, and if there's gaps that exist because of either differences in brain development or alcohol exposure, um, then we could be looking at a weak foundation, right? Or foundation with gaps. And when we think about language development, we have to have memory and processing speed and attention and inhibition and sensory motor aspects in place and being developed in active development in order for our language processes to really develop on top of that, because those are all foundational skills that we need in our brain to develop language. And so those things are hierarchical in that matter. So, as we're developing, as we age and mature, the complexities of these building blocks increase as well. So that when we think about, even as infants, we have a rudimentary understanding of cause and effect. I'm in my crib and I cry and my mom shows up is a rudimentary understanding of cause and effect. But it is that rudimentary, right? It's very, very rudimentary. Those executive functions, which cause and effect kind of go into that, and consequences from that, get more and more complex over time. And we know that our brains are actively in development throughout our 20s. With regards to those executive function, there's no one agreed upon model of how the brain develops or how the executive functions are kind of broken out or labeled. You'll find lots of different models and representations of executive function. So even if we're trying to understand behavior or executive function, we have to look at um, the fundamental, we have to look at the intermediate, and we have to look at those higher order thinking skills. When we talk about the executive functions in this particular model or framework, we're talking about initiation, planning, organization, mental flexibility, and reasoning or judgment, kind of bringing that all together. And those are the 5 executive function areas that we've specifically pulled out for this, because there are a couple of other areas that may have executive functions to consider, like working memory is a very complex memory type that is a higher order thinking skill, but memory, all of the different subtypes of memory, working memory being one of them, is really truly foundational to learning and behavior. So that's why it ends up in that orange or fundamental level. So here's the 5 explained a little bit in more detail. The manual goes much, much further in defining each one of these building blocks, but these orange fundamental building blocks are the foundation, and they're also very, very sensitive to being disrupted. So when there is alcohol exposure or prenatal substance exposure of some sort that does disrupt development, or any type of change or difference, even acquired brain injury, um, can affect and will likely affect these because they are so sensitive to that disruption. If it may last just a little while, or we may be able to fill in gaps pretty quickly, or it may be more of a long-term disruption. But these fundamental ones are very, very sensitive to just being disruptive. So we have to be able to start here in understanding why a student is functioning the way they're functioning. The intermediate building blocks are then built on top of that foundational or fundamental level. And those are the language, all new learning concepts and information, as well as visual spatial building blocks. And then the higher order thinking skills, which are the social emotional competencies and executive function. We know that these are not only in depth and huge when we're talking about the way kids function. Each one of these building blocks could be a full college course, could be a full career. We know this. This is a very simplistic representation of a very remarkable and powerful organ such as the brain. So We're boiling it down to the basics here. The way also our brain interacts with those different areas and the different lobes of our brain and the hemispheres and all of those areas that we know that are intricately connected, and rely on one another to fully function, are why we're talking about this, because one change or one gap in the um, in one building block, well, let alone many, can affect all of the building blocks. So that processing speed gap could show up as a social emotional um, deficit area, or a learning process deficit area. So if we don't have that truly identified, then we might be missing the boat with our interventions, and may not be aligned appropriately. We also know that there are hallmarks of brain injury or hallmarks of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And hallmarks might affect one or more of the building blocks. So when we think about these hallmarks, we think about unevenness, we think about fatigue and endurance issues, and we think about transition difficulties. And there's one more for fetal alcohol spectrum disorder that I'll get to after this, but unevenness is really that scattered profile, if you will, of a child's performance across skills or content area. So it could look as across settings. So I might be able to calm myself and get back on track in one area or one environment, one classroom, or at home. I'm able to do that, but at school I'm not. So the generalization across that environment or setting may not be there. It also might affect over time. So on Monday, you, as a teacher, ask me a question and I'm able to produce the right response. And on Thursday of that same week, you ask me that same question and I'm not able to produce the right response. That is an unevenness across time or over that time frame that really could be a brain function. It's not about willful disobedience at that point. It's I can't retrieve the same level of information that you asked me to on Monday for whatever reason. We may not be able to identify why. And then also across content areas, right? I'm able to, and this is a graphic representation of an 18-year-old. I'm able to express myself right around the same 18 to 21-year-old chronicle age expectations, but my reading ability is a couple of years behind. And these soft skills or social skills, or I don't even like to call them soft skills because they're not that soft. They're very hard. Abstract reasoning, money and time concept, living skills, those kinds of things could be very, very different. So across content areas, could be looking at a very uneven profile. So that's one hallmark that we might see. Fatigue and endurance issues is another one. Cognitive fatigue is a direct result of disrupted brain pathways in the brain. And so if we understand that I've just literally run out of gas, by noon, I'm really struggling to put two pieces of things together and function correctly because my brain is tired. And all of those cognitive drains have been kind of put into place and depleted over that morning time frame. And so when you ask me to do something in the afternoon, I just may not have that gas in my gas tank, so to speak, to go there and to do that, or to produce the response that you're looking for. One way to think about this is with our, most of us have smartphones now, and if we've got an older smartphone, I have to keep my charger on hand, right? Because that gas tank or battery does not last as long as a new smartphone with lots and lots of memory. And so my new smartphone might last all 24-hour period or even multiple days without being recharged, but my older one doesn't because of endurance issues or fatigue issues that are just built into it, right? And so I have to keep that charger on hand and access to an electrical outlet to refuel. Transition issues. Transitions require a lot of brain power and attention, processing speed, sensory overload, visual spatial issues, especially when I think about a secondary hallway with, 480 other kids trying to get to the same kinds of areas, and the loud noise, the crowded physical space, crunch, the chaos that can exist in that kind of a thing. It's difficult. I'm not able to manage all of those brain functions, or I don't have that in my tank because of fatigue. Really lends itself to kind of those transition issues. But they're unpredictable, they're unexpected, and they're unfamiliar a lot of times. So the more we can build in routines, build in structures that help in those environments to be predictable, to be expected and practiced and known, so that they are familiar, the better our kids are off, because those depletions, or that brain power that's needed then, is decreased, and we have a better opportunity to really navigate that transition better. The other one that I mentioned before that I'm probably going to add as a hallmark, especially for fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, is confabulation. And this is a special consideration for all of us, whether we are a community provider, a educator, a parent, a whomever. Confabulation is a type of memory error. It is a brain related function. It is not a willful awareness of information or unawareness. So it's definitely when confabulation happens, there is really no awareness on behalf of that person that they aren't telling the truth. So it can be a misinterpreted, a fabricated, a distorted type of level of information. And we might chalk that up to "you're lying to me." It really is a memory issue. So please, 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 before we jump to conclusions about calling kids liars, let's have an understanding of how this kid's functioning. And if confabulation is a part of that equation, we need to explicitly um, and fully support this kid. I mean, if it's a subconscious level, we can't be punished, so to speak, for things that we're doing on a subconscious level. And I will tell you that knowing better, so the ability to say, yeah, you know right from wrong, right? And the kid says, yeah, I know that I'm supposed to do X, Y, or Z. And they might come up with the most beautiful result in that knowing better aspect. And then you're like, well, then it's such a different brain process to do better and know better. So knowing better could be there, and you think that they've got it, but actually acting on that and doing something along those lines is a totally different thing. And we need to address it as a totally different thing and consider it a totally different thing. There is a resource, and it is in our resources in this handout. And so you can download this. I don't expect you to read this, about kind of how things could show up with confabulation across some of these different areas of consideration. So you can print this. It's a free download on this Jumpstart website. So maybe, just maybe, we're asking kids to do an impossible task. And if we're not looking at the abilities of a child through the understanding of that child's brain function, then we may not be able to address, or may be spinning our wheels for an awfully long time trying to address things that were not exactly aligned in our resources, in our interventions, and in our supports. Where are we? We're good. Resources are next. So I will point out a few of these resources. The building blocks of brain development is spelled out in detail in our Brain Injury in Children and Youth, a manual for educators. It's a free download at this website, actually on multiple websites. Another resource that I want to highlight is was created in Alaska, and it's called the 8 Magic Keys. And they can be, especially for kids with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, they can be that magic, truly. Um, it's truly 8 simplistic ways to think about instruction, whether it be at home or in school, that we want to think about how we're supporting kids in a concrete way with routines in a very specific and explicit way with consistency, with repetition, simplicity, and not making things too difficult or multi-step instructions, with structures, both in our environment as well as our kind of scaffolding of those learning opportunities, and active supervision. We know that kids can develop lots and lots and will develop lots and lots of skills with the right supports and services along the way. And these are some of those really basic things that we can think about. There's a video on the CDE website. I've obtained permission from Department of Ed in Alaska, who created this video. It's a 21-minute video, and it goes through each and every one of these 8 keys and shows you why or how it might look if you're not doing it well, and what might go wrong, and how it looks if you are doing well, and how that can make all the difference in the world for kids on this spectrum. So it's a great little easy, simple tool to think about. It is on this first website. The 8 Magic Keys are here on the FASD website. The manual is also on there. There's a link to it. And that's also on the TBI website. Understanding the Brain online learning series. There's a myriad of modules, pre-recorded modules that can be viewed in varying lengths, but lots of great information there, and can be obtained. Credit can be obtained for watching those. So if you're an educator that wants a little licensure credit for your next licensing process, definitely visit that online learning series. There's an education and FASD toolkit that is consistently being updated and changed. So that is there, the building blocks of brain development, more information on that, and a couple of different ways to access different levels of information for that. And then that's the early identification Illuminate Colorado link to those providers across our state that identify FASD and are trained in that area. This is my contact information, so don't hesitate to reach out to me if you've got questions. I also do, and I didn't put them on the resource list, but I also do monthly office hours, and for an hour and a half every month. Actually, next week is, I think it's Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. If you go to either the FASD or the TBI CDE website, you can register for those. And that is really an open dialogue. We usually get a handful of people to, depending on the day and the content, maybe up to 25 or 30 people, but it's a really intimate time to ask questions, what ifs. I don't need to know any personally identified information at all, and I choose not to, so please don't bring that as part of the thing, but any questions can be asked and we can have dialogue and an open exchange of information and resources shared at that point. Brain Steps Colorado is a program that I wanted to also let you guys know about. It's a great resource. I co-coordinate this program with my colleague, Tony Grishman. at the Department of Education, and it's for school districts and or BOCES at that level of in a district or BOCES that is a school consulting program. And these teams are multidisciplinary by nature. And so lots of different disciplines come together to represent those different areas of expertise on this team. And they're trained in brain injury, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and the building blocks of brain development, and how to really identify kids functioning across those areas. So there's more information at that website about brain steps, or to find out if you are, if your particular district or BOCES has a brain steps team. And without further ado, I will have Donna talk about Cooter's brain steps team or brain injury resource team.
Thank you, Heather. And Heather, thank you very much for sharing your expertise in the area of FASD. It's really valuable information, and really appreciate all the information and resources. I just want to share a few moments about Poudre School District's Brain Injury Resource Team. We are part of Brain Steps Colorado, so our members have gone through training with Colorado Department of Education. Our team is made up of OTs, speech therapists, school psychologists, nurses, and educators. So we bring a variety of perspectives and training to the team. We do call it a brain injury team, and as Heather outlined in the beginning, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, substance abuse doesn't fall under that umbrella of acquired brain injury, but the behaviors and other outward signs that you might see are very similar to any insult to the brain, whether it's a traumatic brain injury or non-traumatic injury. So we are happy to consult with you or your teams on any questions related to brain injury or fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and provide some strategies and resources. We are available to provide observations of students, consultation, attend team meetings, be part of the IEP or 504 planning process, as well as share resources with parents. We do have a resource library with manuals and books on a variety of topics that we also loan out to staff. So my contact information is on the next slide. Feel free to reach out by email or phone, and I'd be happy to consult with you. Thank you for joining us. We'll open it up. I'll see if we're a small group, so I'll see if I can find the unmute button, but feel free to put any questions that you may have in the chat. I did put a couple of links in there, one to the original flyer for tonight's trainings, and if you click on the session resources, that will bring up the slides. I also put a link to what Heather just mentioned towards the end, the CDE FASD website, and that lists the office hours and how to get information and registration information there.
Great, thank you for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see how to unmute everybody, but I could go through and just click on your microphones if you want to chime in, if there's questions.
Yeah, go ahead and put those in the chat if you like, and we'll try and get you unmuted if we can. I found it earlier.
Did you? See, when I click on allow mic, it still has a little X through it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. So use the chat, please.
Yes. Any questions?
Do you have any suggestions on working with elementary age students who struggle with confabulation, which is leading to peer conflicts and difficulties? Boy, if I had the magic book of any level, elementary included, of suggestions, What it's going to be is, and please go to the Jumpstart website. That is done by a psychologist, I believe, out of the UK or Canada, um, who has a lot more information on confabulation. And I don't have a ton of really specific, although, I mean, you can look at the manual. There's a lot of suggestions in there, but conflict resolution strategies, even at elementary school, I can't say enough about. They are teachable, they are doable. Um, and you can get some resolution along that path for sure, as conflicts arise for whatever reason, confabulation being one of them. And just building that knowledge with that student, um, specifically, and done thoughtfully and well, because you don't want to embarrass them. You don't want to put them on the spot. You don't want to, call out that they have memory issues in front of everybody, but you can label it as a brain issue for sure. And you can do that gently, and making sure that, memory issues are understood at whatever level, of peers, that's appropriate. So there's definitely ways that you can kind of peel apart those, layers, so to speak, and address those. But you can, if you put confabulation into the Googler, you're going to get a ton. So.
Okay, I did open up the mic, so if you would like to ask a question, just go ahead and unmute your microphone or use the chat.
Okay, Randall, is FAS a diagnosis that qualifies for an IEP, and how is it best discussed?
Great question.
How is it best to discuss this at an IEP minute? That is a great question. So, short answer, no diagnosis, FASD included, qualifies automatically for an IEP. It's part of the equation, for sure. It's a consideration. Any diagnosis is a consideration, for sure. But as we know, special education criteria requires a two-prong approach. One being a health condition, and when we're talking about fetal alcohol syndrome, it really is intended to be looked at and viewed and understood as a health condition. So a condition of some sort, a area of need of some sort. In this case, fetal alcohol syndrome, and educational impact. When you have the actual syndrome diagnosed, you're going to see educational impact. And so both of those two would meet those two-prong requirements for special education. The educational impact is where we talk about the application of the building blocks of brain development, because what does that look like? What does that mean? It gives you the now what of intervention and supports and services. So understanding that, a kid's struggling because they've got fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or fetal alcohol syndrome, doesn't give us the criteria or the plan, right? Or programming necessary to be put in place for that individual to get them further down that road as far as learning targets. So that's where the building blocks of brain development comes into play, around understanding not only the criteria and eligibility kind of checkbox, but also now here's what we need to really look at by way of supports. So long answer to a question, but
Heather, can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because fetal alcohol syndrome is not a disability category. So what advice would you give teams as far as eligibility options?
that's a great thing to add for sure. Have I stopped sharing? Okay. The thing to think about, and the intent truly of the federal government when IDEA was created, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was written, is that fetal alcohol syndrome and fetal alcohol spectrum disorders be considered as a health condition. Those health conditions would then be viewed under an acute and or chronic health condition under other health impairment. Other health impairment is the special education category that can be considered. It doesn't have to be applied. If it's not the best fit, it doesn't have to be applied, because also the intent of special education law is that once you meet eligibility for any disability category, all needs need to be identified and met regardless. Um, our brains really are meant to categorize and find patterns. That's what they do naturally. And so when we think about specific learning disability, we think about kind of what types of programs might be appropriate, and we categorize those as such. If other health impairment, because it's so loose, doesn't really give us that can be a double-edged sword, right? Other health impairment, the criteria is strength, vitality, and alertness. Doesn't give us a lot, but if we utilize the building blocks of brain development, which is in our Colorado guidance for OHI, specifically for a health condition that has brain impacts, then it gives us that path. It gives us that understanding of, yep, there's sensory issues because of our assessments and our body of evidence that we've gathered. And so some of those sensory things that they might be doing in the room that is known as the autism program might be very appropriate. That is intended in the law, that I will be able to access those sensory interventions that make sense because I am showing that need, regardless of the category that I'm in. If I'm in OHI, or I've met eligibility requirements for OHI. If I need, math supports, and that's kind of over here in math intervention under whatever kind of category, I can access that, because that is the intent, and that is a need that has been identified. If it's behavioral need, I can access that. If it's life skills needs, I can access that type of support. So great questions and considerations. It's not it's not that every single student with fetal alcohol syndrome must be identified under OHI, but the feds really did want to consider that under the health condition, and therefore OHI is a consideration that could be and should be probably on the table for that IEP team to take a look at. Great question.
Thank you, Heather. Any other questions from the chat, or you can unmute?
Oh, we are at time, aren't we?
I guess we are, actually.
I appreciate you guys joining us, and as far as all the providers out there and the educators, thank you for what you do each and every day. And parents, again, we can't do this without you. So we're teams. We're in it together.
That's right. Thank you all for joining tonight, and reach out with any questions to Heather or myself.